Hey everyone, Brandon here, and let's talk about this Total War Warhammer 2 reveal trailer, what it confirms, and everything you might have missed. Our next crack at a Creative Assembly Total War game is going to be loaded with new locations, 4 new playable races, and a huge new story campaign for each faction surrounding the Great Vortex. But I'll come back to that. For now, let's start with that first shot. Right off the bat, we see a lush jungle landscape with a pyramid in the background. These humid jungles are the continent of Lustria, part of the western continents that make up the New World. If you're not familiar with the Warhammer world, this is the New World, a collection of continents across the sea from the Old World, fittingly enough. Lustria is the southern continent, home of the Lizard Man. Nagaroth is the land of the Dark Elves, up here. And this circular island continent off the east coast of Nagaroth is the homeland of the High Elves, called Ulthuan. Warhammer 2 will be set in all these locations, as well as another tropical continent over here, called the Southlands. But for those who own both Total War Warhammer 1 and 2, you will get access to a combined campaign map covering the geographic areas of the first and second games, as well as any owned playable race after the game launches, so you'll be able to incorporate Old World again as well. Now that our geography lesson is done, we dive through the thick canopy where we see the first of the new races in Total War Warhammer 2, moving quietly and super seriously through the jungle. These are the Dark Elves. These basic infantry and range units can be distinguished by their dark purple garments, and though it's hard to make out, this unique crest here. Here we get a better shot of their ornate armor and those sweet dual-shot crossbows. Immediately afterward, we switch perspectives to the next confirmed race faction, the High Elves, marching in the opposite direction. This one's more obvious thanks to the big emblazoned crests on each spearman shield and their bright blue accent colors. And as is fitting for a highly magical faction like the High Elves, this expedition is led by an Archmage, but we'll come back to him in a minute. At the 25-second mark, we get our first glimpse of Witch Elves, the savage units of the Dark Elves that whip themselves into a frenzy with blood and poison cocktails. Here we get a much better view. Given their sneaky introduction and twin daggers, it's fair to say they'll probably fill the fragile but high damage unit role, perfect for flanking. Jumping ahead to 1 minute and 55 seconds in the trailer, we finally meet the natives of Lustria, the third playable race in Warhammer 2, the Lizardmen. Here we see one of the 2 main subspecies of lizardmen, the Skinks, which are smaller and serve as being basic infantry. In the lore, they're engineers, workers, and some of them fulfill priestly duties. Given their diversity, there's a lot of roles we could see them fulfill when it comes to unit types. But based on these implements they're holding, they look like they're going to be at least a low-cost melee unit option. Right behind them are the muscle of the lizardmen, the larger, brawnier subspecies of lizardmen called the Saurus or Saurus. Here we see them with at least 2 different weapon types, the one-handed clubs and shield, so we can probably expect an armored infantry unit type, as well as the two-handed clubs and axes to fulfill more of a shock trooper unit. But not seen here are the terrifying armored temple guards, so expect a lot more diversity in the melee unit types. Finally, we pan up to get a look at the supreme leader class of the Lizardmen, the Slann. They're a dying race, and despite looking like fat frogs, they're ancient, incredibly powerful magic users that were the first race created by the godlike Old Ones. This particular Slann is probably Lord Mazdamundi, who's the ruling Slann of the temple city of Hexodal in the northern end of Lustria. In-game, it's safe to assume he'll be one of the Lizardmen's 2 legendary lords and bring some crazy magical destructiveness to the battlefield. And speaking of legendary lords, jumping back to the 42-second mark in the trailer, we see the legendary lord and king of the Dark Elves himself, Malekith the Witch King. He's an incredibly powerful magic user and warrior, and wields his sword Destroyer that, according to Warhammer lore, can unmake enchantments and sap knowledge. With that in mind, it's possible Malekith could function as a kind of anti-caster hero, both dispelling buffs and draining power from enemy magic users. Lastly, we get back to that High Elf Archmage, who, on closer inspection, is probably Teclis, the lore master of Hoeth, and likely the magic-based legendary lord of the High Elves faction. Based on the look of his moonstaff here, his war crown, and this scroll that's probably the scroll of Hoeth, his appearance fits the lore of the character. Teclis is one of the greatest magic users in the current Warhammer lore, and has a twin brother Tyrion, who's the greatest High Elven warrior alive, and it would make sense to position these 2 as the legendary lords of the faction. Moving forward, we see Teclis approach some kind of overgrown stone power source. This one's a bit of a mystery. It could be a magical waystone, or it could be one of the power points in the magical network called the Geomantic Web. It's a long story, but according to the Warhammer fantasy lore, the web was created by the Slann, making it a possibility given the Lustrian setting and based on the tribal stonework designs you can see here and here. As he activates the stone, we see Teclis have a vision, which gives us our first glimpse into the storyline of Total War Warhammer 2. What he's seeing here is a window into the past. High Elven mages gathered around their leader, Kalidor Dragon Tamer, channel their massive power to create the Great Vortex. The Great Vortex is incredibly important in Warhammer lore, and was created as a last-ditch effort to stave off destruction from the encroaching forces of chaos. It's basically a cosmic exhaust port for the chaotic energies that build up and spill over into the world. A few seconds later, we see the Dark Elves launch their ambush. We get definitive confirmation High Elf faces aren't immune to crossbow bolts, and we see Teclis creates a magical barrier seen here. This could be a look at one of his activatable lore abilities in the battlefield, or it could just be a cool looking spell for the trailer. But before the two factions of elves can throw down, out of the fog we see a lizardman carnosaur, basically their version of a T-Rex, which will likely be one of the monstrous unit types of that faction. Here again we see Teclis use his powers to dispel fog, and again, this could be a sneak peek at one of his lord powers, either dispelling the fog of war in campaign map or tactical map, or it could just be a cool spell for the trailer. But we see that this isn't just any carnosaur. It's ridden by a Saurus. Taking a closer look, the totem on the saddle here, this spear that he's holding, and this ornate jewelry on both the rider and the mount indicate this is probably the legendary Kroq-Gar and his carnosaur mount Grimlock. Kroq-Gar is an ancient warrior and the current leader of the Saurus armies, who wields a godly spear that is said to curse anyone it touches with visions of their own doom. He'll likely serve as the other legendary lord in the Lizardman faction, and, given the lore, could potentially sap the morale of enemy units in combat. Jumping ahead, we see the faction leaders send their armies toward one another, before freezing here to get a look at one of the flying units of the High Elves faction, the Great Eagle Riders descending over the ground units. A few seconds later, we see these bluish winged units coming from the other direction. Now the faction on the right appears to be the Lizardmen given the unit size and color of the ground units, which means these flying units are likely Pterodon Riders, the flying harass unit of the Lizardmen, or potentially the Lizardmen's nastier air cavalry, the Ripperdactyl Riders. As we pull back, we see several of the Lizardmen's temple pyramids before pulling all the way back to see the Great Vortex raging over the Isle of the Dead on Ulthuan. The Great Vortex is going to play a huge part in this campaign, though how that's going to affect the gameplay, we'll have to wait and see. Now as the trailer comes to a close, we get the Total War Warhammer 2 tagline, "Defend your world, destroy theirs," which could be a nod to the central war between the factions of Ulthuan, Nagaroth, Lustria, and the Southlands. Or, with a little bit of speculation, it could be a reference to the Chaos forces held at bay by the Great Vortex. We don't really know. Finally, there's a teaser at the very end of the trailer of what appears to be Creative Assembly confirming the Skaven race. See right here? This is a rat. And if you're not familiar, the Skaven are a horde of diseased, plague-ridden rat folk that span a vast underground empire and swarm their opponents with the crushing weight of their numbers and dark warpstone magic. Now, given the boils on our rat here and here, its ominous glowing red eyes, and the fact it's crawling over what looks to be the same artifact Teclis was activating, it's safe to assume the Skaven are going to be the fourth faction. I anticipate we'll see them behave along the same lines of the dwarves in Total War Warhammer 1, being able to move underground and ambush opponents, but we'll have to wait for more information to know for sure. I'm pumped for this sequel, but how do you feel? Did the new factions and locations interest you? Let us know in the comments below, and for more Total War Warhammer 2 as it comes, keep it right here on IGN.